On the morning of March 5, 1973, as snow drifted across the Transbaikal military district, a column of newly issued Soviet tanks rolled out of a proving ground near Chita, eastern Siberia. To an untrained eye, they looked like just another armored unit rotating through exercises. But to the officers watching from a frost-covered command post, this moment carried weight far beyond routine. The tank was new, the T-72 Ural. Compact, low-slung, brutal in silhouette. It was not designed for parades in Red Square. It was designed for war at the edges of the Soviet world. And one of those edges, rarely discussed in public but constantly studied in secret, lay across the Sea of Japan. Since World War II, Moscow had never fully trusted Tokyo. The scars of Khalkhin-Joel in 1939 still lingered in Soviet military memory, where General Georgy Zhukov had crushed Japanese forces in Mongolia. The Cold War did not erase that history. It froze it, waiting. As a young tank commander, Senior Lieutenant Viktor Sokolov stood beside his machine. He reportedly muttered to a fellow officer, "This one isn't for Europe. This one is for the East." That quiet realization captures the essence of the T-72's role. Viewers, ask yourself, why would the Soviets pour resources into a new main battle tank for a front that hadn't fired a shot in decades? To understand the T-72's mission against Japan, you have to understand Soviet fear, not of invasion tomorrow, but a strategic surprise. By the late 1960s, Japan was no longer the defeated empire of 1945. Under the U.S. Japan Security Treaty, American forces were permanently stationed at Yokosuka, Misawa, and Okinawa. Soviet intelligence reports, circulated through the GRU, warned that in a NATO Warsaw Pact war, Japan could become a launch pad for U.S. naval and air operations against the Soviet Far East. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, commander of the Soviet Navy, reportedly warned the Politburo in 1968, "The Pacific flank is no longer quiet. It is only silent." The Soviet response was layered. Submarines, coastal missile brigades, and armor. The T-72 was cheaper than the T-64, easier to maintain in harsh climates, and rugged enough for Siberian terrain. Engineers at Eurovagonzavod built it with cold starts in mind, thick armor angle for ambushes, and a 125mm gun capable of killing any Japanese tank before it could fire back. Emotionally, this mattered. Soviet planners believed Japan, backed by the U.S., might attempt a limited strike on the Kuril Islands, territory seized by the Red Army in August 1945. The T-72 was meant to ensure that if that day came, the Red Army would already be waiting. Would Japan dare land if steel like this stood in the way? The geography itself shaped the tank. The Soviet Far East is unforgiving. Frozen winters, swampy summers, narrow roads, and volcanic rock. Unlike Central Europe, this was not a land of highways and open plains. The T-72's low profile allowed it to hide behind ridgelines and forest edges, ideal for defensive warfare along island chains and coastal approaches. In 1976, during exercises near Khabarovsk, Soviet observers noted that T-72 units were drilled not in sweeping offensives, but in counter-landing scenarios. The imagined enemy was clear without being named. Japanese self-defense forces, possibly supported by U.S. Marines. Colonel Anatoly Lebedev, a training officer at the time, later recalled, "We were taught to stop the landing, then push it back into the sea." This wasn't rhetoric. It was doctrine. The T-72's autoloader reduced crew size, meaning fewer trained soldiers were needed in remote regions. Its diesel engine was reliable in extreme cold, a critical factor east of Lake Baikal. Emotionally, crews stationed there felt forgotten. Letters from home took weeks. Yet they believed their role was vital. One tanker wrote in his diary in 1978, "If war comes, no one will remember us, but Japan will." Do modern viewers underestimate how much planning goes into wars that never happen? Japan, for its part, noticed. Declassified Japanese Defense Agency assessments from the late 1970s identified the T-72 as a significant escalation in Soviet ground capability in the north. Although Japan's constitution limited offensive action, the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force, JGSDF, was modernizing fast. Tanks like the Type 74 were designed with Soviet armor in mind. Specifically, tanks like the T-72. Japanese officers studied Soviet doctrine obsessively, especially after satellite imagery confirmed new armored regiments deployed on Sakhalin Island. A Japanese colonel, quoted anonymously in a 1981 defense journal, warned, "The Soviet tank is not for Europe alone. It stares at us across the water." The psychological effect mattered as much as the physical one. The T-72 signaled that Moscow was serious about defending its Pacific frontier. It told Tokyo that any attempt to revise post-war borders would be met not with diplomacy, but with steel. Ask yourself, was deterrence the T-72's true weapon, or was it simply waiting for orders it never received? By 1980, the T-72 had become a symbol inside the Soviet military. Young conscripts arriving in the Far East felt pride mixed with isolation. Training manuals emphasized fighting without air superiority, assuming U.S. and Japanese aircraft would dominate the skies. This shaped how the tank was used. Ambush concealment, rapid relocation. Instructors drilled crews to fire first and disappear. One oft-repeated saying among tankers went, 3 shots, then move, the 4th is death. The tank was never meant to charge Tokyo. It was meant to make Japan hesitate. And in Cold War strategy, hesitation could decide everything. Before we move on, subscribe for more Cold War stories like this, because the most dangerous weapons are often the ones that never fire. In the background of all Soviet planning for Japan stood an uncomfortable truth Moscow rarely admitted publicly. The Far Eastern Front was thinly populated, logistically stretched, and psychologically vulnerable. By 1971, internal Soviet military reviews described the region east of Lake Baikal as strategically exposed. Roads were limited, rail lines were few, and units stationed there could not rely on rapid reinforcement from the west. This reality shaped how the T-72 was intended to be used. It was not meant to advance endlessly. It was meant to hold ground under pressure. During a classified command exercise in Vladivostok in October 1974, Soviet officers simulated a Japanese amphibious landing near the southern Kurils. According to a later memoir by Major General Yuri Pavlov, the scenario assumed air superiority was lost within 48 hours. Pavlov recalled a senior planner stating bluntly, "After that, the tanks are all that remain." For crews hearing this, the emotional weight was heavy. They were being told, indirectly, that survival depended on their machines and their nerves. The T-72's armor layout, its compact silhouette, and its ability to fire powerful heat rounds from concealed positions made it ideal for such desperate holding actions. The Soviet belief was simple. If Japan could be made to bleed heavily in the first hours, political restraint would follow. Viewers, consider this. How different does war planning look when the goal is not victory, but survival long enough for diplomacy to intervene? The Kuril Islands were the silent obsession. Captured by Soviet forces in August 1945, they remained disputed territory, claimed by Japan as the Northern Territories. To Moscow, this dispute was more than diplomatic noise. It was a potential trigger point. Soviet intelligence assessments from 1975 warned that Japan might attempt a limited operation to seize one or more islands, betting that escalation could be controlled. The T-72 was Moscow's answer to that gamble. Beginning in 1978, elements of the 18th Machine Gun Artillery Division on Sakhalin began integrating T-72 units into island defense plans. These were not glamorous deployments. Crews lived in cramped barracks, surrounded by fog, mud, and isolation. One tanker, Sergeant Alexei Morozov, later recalled in an oral history interview, "We trained knowing the sea was behind us. There was nowhere to retreat." That psychological factor mattered. Unlike European fronts, retreat was not an option, only resistance. The T-72's ability to operate independently, with minimal logistical support, fit this grim logic. Japanese planners noticed. By the early 1980s, JGSDF exercises increasingly emphasized anti-armor tactics in cold and coastal environments. Even without shots fired, the arms race was shaping minds on both sides. Ask yourself, Can deterrence still succeed when both sides prepare for the same narrow strip of land? Soviet fear was not just Japanese, it was American. Any conflict involving Japan meant the United States will be present almost immediately. U.S. Marines stationed in Okinawa, naval task forces operating from Yokosuka, and carrier groups in Pacific all loomed large in Soviet planning. Documents released after the Cold War showed that Soviet strategists assumed U.S. forces would attempt to neutralize armored units quickly using air power. This influenced how the T-72 was to be employed: dispersed, hidden, mobile. In a 1982 training directive, commanders were instructed to avoid massed armor formations in the Far East, instead favoring decentralized platoon-level actions. A Soviet instructor famously told his class, "If you fight like in Europe, you die like in Europe." The emotional tension among crews was intense. They trained knowing they might never see the enemy tank that killed them, only the aircraft overhead. Yet they trusted the T-72's low profile and rapid firing capability to give them a chance. Viewers, pause for a moment. How does it feel to train for a war where you expect to be outmatched from the sky? By 1983, Cold War tensions reached a new peak. The shooting down of Korean Airlines Flight 007 by Soviet air defenses intensified Japanese distrust overnight. Tokyo strengthened cooperation with Washington, while Moscow quietly reinforced its Far Eastern units. Additional T-72s were moved east, though officially unannounced. One Soviet logistics officer later admitted, "We moved them at night. No speeches, no flags." The secrecy spoke volumes. Soviet leaders feared signaling panic, yet could not ignore the risk of escalation. For tank crews, this period was emotionally draining. Training intensified. Live-fire exercises increased. Leaves were canceled. Many believed war was closer than ever. A diary entry from a conscript dated September 1983 reads, "They tell us nothing, but everyone feels it." The T-72, in this moment, became less a symbol and more a lifeline. Would it ever be used? Or was its mere presence enough to hold the line? Japanese military thinkers debated the same question. Internal JGSDF studies acknowledged that Soviet armor resistance, especially from T-72 units, would make any northern operation costly and politically dangerous. One Japanese defense analyst wrote in 1984, "Even limited success risks unlimited escalation." That sentence alone reveals the quiet power of the T-72. It was not about conquest. It was about cost, making any action so expensive that leaders hesitated. The Cold War was full of such calculations where steel replaced speeches. Ask yourself, how many wars never happened because someone ran the numbers and stepped back? As the mid-1980s approached, cracks began to show. Economic strain, overextension, and shifting leadership priorities weakened Soviet resolve. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, emphasis slowly shifted away from confrontation. Yet T-72 units remained in place. No one wanted to be the first to pull back. A Soviet officer later recalled, "Peace is easier to declare than to trust." The tank stayed where it was, silent, loaded, waiting. By 1987, arms control talks eased global tensions, but the Far East remained cautious. The T-72's role did not vanish overnight. Crews continued to train, to wait, to believe they might still be called upon. The emotional fatigue was real. Many left the service feeling relief mixed with uncertainty. Had their sacrifice mattered? When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the question answered itself. The T-72 had done its job without firing a shot against Japan. It had shaped decisions, delayed actions, and held a fragile line. Deterrence had won, quietly. So when we ask what the Soviet T-72 was built to do against Japan, the answer is not invasion or conquest. It was built to prevent a war by making one unbearable. And before we move into part 2, ask yourself, was the Cold War won by weapons or by the fear of using them? And if you want more deep, real history Cold War stories like this, subscribe for more videos, because some of the most important battles never happened. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union found itself facing a strategic paradox in the Far East. The very presence of the T-72 meant to deter Japan, now demanded constant justification. Every tank stationed east of Lake Baikal consumed fuel, spare parts, train crews, and political attention, yet removing them would signal weakness. In January 1981, a classified briefing prepared for the Soviet General Staff warned, any reduction of armored forces in Pacific Theater may be interpreted as opportunity. The language was careful, almost fearful. Japan had not fired a shot, but the assumption was that restraint was temporary, conditional, and reversible. Soviet officers stationed in Primorsky Krai felt this tension daily. Captain Oleg Kravchenko, a T-72 company commander, later recalled, "We trained like men already condemned, but still expected to be calm." The emotional strain was immense. They were told war was unlikely, but not impossible. Viewers, consider this. How do soldiers maintain discipline when the threat is invisible and undefined? Across the sea, Japan was undergoing its own quiet transformation. Though constitutionally restricted from offensive war, the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force steadily refined doctrines meant to counter Soviet armor. War games conducted between 1981 and 1984 increasingly featured scenarios involving Soviet T-72 breakthroughs on Hokkaido following escalation in the Kuriles. Japanese planners assumed that if Soviet tanks reached Japanese soil, it would mean the Cold War had already gone catastrophically wrong. Yet they trained anyway. A JGSDF officer wrote in a 1982 internal report, "The Soviet tank does not need to cross our borders to threaten us. Its existence already shapes our strategy." This mirrors Soviet thinking almost exactly. Both sides feared the other's preparation more than their intentions. Emotionally, this created a strange balance. Mutual suspicion held in place by mutual restraint. Ask yourself, can fear itself become a stabilizing force? The United States amplified everything. American naval patrols increased in the Sea of Japan. Carrier groups moved closer during periods of tension, and joint Japan exercises grew more complex. Soviet intelligence tracked every movement. In 1982, Pacific Fleet commanders warned Moscow that U.S. Marines could be deployed to northern Japan within days. The implication was clear. Any clash involving Japan would escalate immediately into a superpower confrontation. For T-72 crews, this knowledge was sobering. They were no longer just facing Japanese tanks. They were facing the possibility of American air power, precision strikes, and overwhelming logistics. One Soviet instructor told recruits bluntly, "You are not fighting Japan. You are fighting time. Time until reinforcements arrived. Time until diplomacy intervened. Time until nuclear thresholds loomed." Viewers, pause here. How does conventional warfare function when nuclear escalation is always in the background? In September 1983, the Cold War nearly slipped out of control. The destruction of KAL-007 hardened Japanese public opinion against the Soviet Union overnight. Protests erupted in Tokyo. Defense budgets increased. Moscow, meanwhile, feared misinterpretation. Soviet leadership quietly ordered heightened readiness in Far Eastern armored units. T-72 crews were placed on extended alert. No announcements were made. No speeches given. One tanker later recalled, "We knew something was wrong because no one explained anything." That silence was terrifying. Emotionally, this was the peak of tension for many. War still did not come, but belief in peace weakened. Ask yourself, how many wars begin not with intent, but with misunderstanding? The winter of 1983 to 1984 was especially harsh. Equipment failures increased. Morale dipped, yet training continued. Soviet doctrine demanded readiness regardless of weather or politics. A battalion exercise conducted near Ussurisk simulated rappelling an amphibious landing supported by Japanese and U.S. air power. The outcome was grim but acceptable by Soviet standards. Heavy losses, delayed enemy advance. The lesson was not victory. It was endurance. The T-72 was fulfilling its purpose. It made any scenario costly enough to deter first moves. Viewers, reflect on this. Is deterrence morally cleaner than war, or simply war postponed? By 1985, cracks in the system could no longer be ignored. The Soviet economy was under strain. Units in the Far East reported shortages. Spare parts arrived late. Crews improvised. Yet the tank stayed. When Mikhail Gorbachev assumed leadership in March 1985, he inherited not just weapons, but expectations. Reducing tensions in Europe was one thing. The Pacific was another. Japan remained aligned with Washington. Trust was minimal. Gorbachev's advisors warned that sudden withdrawals could embolden Japanese territorial claims. So the T-72 remained, frozen in place like a chess piece no one dared move. Japanese analysts noticed the stagnation. Soviet forces were still present, but less aggressive. Intelligence reports from 1986 described Soviet armored units as defensive in posture. This mattered. It suggested a shift from confrontation to containment. Japanese doctrine responded in kind, emphasizing surveillance and denial rather than offense. The T-72 had changed behavior without ever firing. Ask yourself, how often do weapons shape peace more than diplomacy? Inside Soviet units, emotions shifted from fear to exhaustion. Long deployments, limited leave, and constant readiness wore down crews. Some began to doubt the purpose of their sacrifice. A letter intercepted by military censors in 1987 read, "We are guarding a war that does not exist." Yet even that sentence reveals the truth. The war did not exist precisely because it was being guarded against. Arms control talks between Washington and Moscow eased global pressure, but Japan remained cautious. The Korean dispute persisted. T-72s stayed positioned. No one declared victory. No one declared peace. The Cold War ended not with triumph, but with quiet relief. By 1988, reductions began slowly, carefully. Tanks were rotated, not withdrawn. Symbolism mattered. Every movement was calculated to avoid misinterpretation. Deterrence remained the guiding principle. Japanese defense journals began describing Soviet armor as predictable rather than threatening. That alone marked a shift. Predictability is peace's closest ally. When Soviet soldiers heard reforms, reactions were mixed. Hope, skepticism, fatigue. Many wondered if history would remember their role. The T-72 had become something unexpected, not a weapon of war, but a tool of restraint. It shaped choices through fear of consequences. As we move toward the end of this story, ask yourself, did the Cold War end because leaders became wiser, or because the cost of miscalculation became too high to risk? And if you want more deeply researched Cold War stories like this, subscribe for more videos, because silence, too, has a history. When the Soviet Union entered its final years, the Far East felt the change more slowly than anywhere else. In 1989, while crowds filled streets in Eastern Europe, T-72 units near Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, and Sakhalin still conducted routine drills. Orders came, but they were cautious, often vague. Officers sensed history shifting, yet doctrine demanded discipline. A regimental commander reportedly told his men, "Until someone signs something, the enemy still exists." Emotionally, this created confusion. Were they guardians of peace or relics of a fading confrontation? The T-72 sat in revetments, engines cold, ammunition sealed, waiting for a war that no longer seemed inevitable. Viewers, ask yourself, how do soldiers measure victory when nothing happens? Japan watched closely. By 1990, Japanese defense planners recognized that Soviet posture had changed fundamentally. Intelligence reports described Soviet armored units as static and constrained. Yet caution remained. The Kuril Islands dispute was unresolved, and memories of Cold War escalation were still fresh. Japanese officers understood that history could turn quickly. The T-72 still mattered, not because it would attack, but because it represented unfinished business. One Japanese analyst wrote, "Weapons do not vanish when politics change." That sentence captured the lingering anxiety on both sides of the Sea of Japan. Inside Soviet units, morale deteriorated as resources dwindled. Fuel allocations were cut. Spare parts became scarce. Crews cannibalized damaged tanks to keep others operational. A mechanic recalled in a post-Soviet interview, "We kept them alive with faith and wire." Yet the tanks remained symbolically powerful. Officers feared that abandoning them outright could invite miscalculation. The T-72 was no longer a sword. It was a warning sign that still needed a stand. When the Soviet Union formally dissolved in December 1991, the moment passed quietly in the Far East. No ceremonies, no dramatic withdrawals, just uncertainty. Some T-72 units were reassigned to the Russian Federation, others left in storage, others abandoned outright. Crews were discharged, transferred, or simply told to go home. One former tanker later said, "We didn't know if we were veterans or witnesses." Emotionally, this was a true end of the Cold War for them, not with celebration, but with silence. Japan reassessed its northern defense posture cautiously. The perceived threat diminished, but it did not disappear. Russian forces still occupied the Kurils. Soviet-era tanks still existed, yet the fear that had driven Cold War planning faded. The T-72's shadow receded. It had fulfilled its role without firing a shot against Japan. Ask yourself, is that failure or the highest form of success? Historians would later debate the T-72's purpose endlessly. Some argue it was overkill, an expensive hedge against an unlikely scenario. Others insisted it was essential. Declassified documents suggest Soviet leaders believed that without credible armed resistance, Japan might have pressed its territorial claims harder during moments of weakness. The T-72 made hesitation rational. It bought time. And in Cold War strategy, time was everything. For the men who served inside those tanks, the experience left lasting marks. Many spoke of isolation, of being stationed far from home for a war no one wanted. One veteran said, "We trained for violence so that violence wouldn't come." That paradox defines Cold War service more than any battle statistic ever could. The rusting hulls left behind in depots across eastern Russia became symbols of a different era. Photographs from the 1990s show T-72s covered in snow, turrets locked forward, paint peeling. Once feared, now forgotten. Yet their absence was just as powerful as their presence had been. Japan no longer planned for Soviet armor landings. The calculations had changed. The Cold War ended not with explosions in the Pacific, but with restraint. The T-72 was designed to fight, but instead it prevented a fight. That outcome rarely makes headlines. It rarely earns medals, but it shapes history all the same. So what was the Soviet T-72 really built to do against Japan? Not invade Tokyo, not roll through Hokkaido. It was built to close doors before anyone tried to open them, to stand in the background of every decision and whisper, "Think carefully." Japan thought carefully. So did Moscow. So did Washington. Steel, fear, and memory combined to keep the peace. The T-72 never fired a shot across the Sea of Japan, and that silence was deliberate. Viewers, this is the uncomfortable truth of deterrence. The most powerful weapons are often the ones history barely notices. Their success is measured in absence, in battles that never happened, in names never carved into memorials. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, how many conflicts today are being held back by forces we never see and decisions we never hear about? The Cold War may be over, but its logic still echoes. And if you want more deeply researched cinematic Cold War stories like this, stories about tension, restraint, and the weapons that shaped the world without firing, subscribe for more videos. Because sometimes the most important victories are the ones no one realizes were ever at risk.